So welcome to this section of our interdependence course. Our first speaker today is Jake Chapman. Welcome Jake, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to start by telling you a little story. And it's my story, and it starts more than 50 years ago when I was a research student at Cambridge. Well, I was at Cambridge for about 8 years, studying physics. While I was there, I became interested in energy, and I read a book by a famous physicist called Weinberg, who was promoting nuclear power. And one of his claims was it was going to be so cheap that we could get as much energy from nuclear power as we could get from the sun. Hang on. As a physicist, I know that if you put a whole lot more energy into something, it's going to get hotter. So I started to become interested in the link between energy use and climate. And I discovered that there was a limit. The projections of energy use then, which was back in the 1960s, suggested that we would run into this thermal limit by sometime between 2020 and 2060. Since then, climate research has shown that carbon dioxide and the greenhouse effect is more important than this energy effect. But it set me off on a journey. My research at that time was into electron microscopes, and I stopped doing it. I moved to the Open University, and while I was there I developed a thing that has now become known as embodied energy analysis. So I worked out how much energy it costs, or it requires, to bake a loaf of bread, to build a house, to make a car, all that sort of thing. I used the results of all this to write a book, and it was called Fuel's Paradise, which started with the simple statement: you can fuel some of the people all of the time, or you can fuel all the people some of the time, but you can't fuel all the people all the time. It was a bestseller. It set me off on a whole new career of doing energy research. And so I started to go around giving talks, trying to persuade people to use energy more efficiently, and to think about the long-term impact of energy use on climate. This is me, 43 years ago, giving one of those talks. This was actually to a group of architects at Milton Keynes Development Corporation. The Open University is in Milton Keynes, and when I first went there was no town called Milton Keynes, it was being built. So it seemed to me an ideal opportunity to try to persuade the architects to build more energy efficient houses. Unfortunately, I failed totally. I wasn't able to get them to change their way of doing things. They thought I was just some long-haired idiot who had a bee in his bonnet about energy use. Now, the Development Corporation, the people who were in charge of developing Milton Keynes, they had noticed that energy projects attracted a lot of publicity. So I said to them, well, look, why don't you let me do some housing experiments? You could actually build some energy efficient houses. I'll monitor them. I'll get paid for doing that by the research councils. And you'll see that the results are good. So they said, yeah, okay, go ahead. So I ended up monitoring, not me personally, but a whole group of people that I was working with, monitored the performance of hundreds of houses in Milton Keynes. And using the results from that, I developed a computer program. This program could accurately predict the energy use in dwellings. And this is what it looked like. Now, some of you are old enough to recognise that this is an MS-DOS program. It was written around 1983, 84, something like that. It's very crude in its interface, way before the Mac or Windows or anything like that. However, it was able to accurately predict the energy use in houses, partly because I had so much good data. It also showed the architects or anybody who was using it where the energy was lost. And the difference between the solid bar and the shaded bar is where somebody's applied insulation to the walls. So using this tool, people are able to improve the design of their houses. And in fact, in the mid-1980s, the Development Corporation, this is Milton Keynes, wanting more publicity, decided to have an exhibition of modern housing. And they also decided that everybody who was submitting their designs for this exhibition had to have their design evaluated using this bit of software, which was wonderful, because suddenly architects were using this software, and to my surprise and their delight, they were suddenly designing energy efficient houses. I mean, seriously, they were as good in those days as the modern building regulations requires. So I spent 10 years trying to persuade people to build more energy efficient houses and failed. I gave them a tool and it succeeded. So that was the first and biggest lesson that I learnt from this. That if I give people a tool that they can learn from, it's far, far more effective than lecturing them. And the reason is that they learn for themselves. Now, although I've told the story around energy, I've also had exactly the same experience in teaching at the Open University and in trying to help people learn how to meditate. In all sorts of areas of my life, it always works to help people to learn for themselves rather than tell them what to do. All right. So, I'm not going to lecture about the importance of personal awareness, which is what I'm talking about here today. Instead, I'm just going to teach two simple tools. They're very easy to learn. There's nothing complex or complicated about them. But that doesn't mean that they don't have pretty good effects. But the effects, I can't predict what the effect will be when you do it. Because what everybody gets out of using these tools is unique to them. Just as the architects who were trying to design an energy efficient house, some of them focused on improving the heating system, some of them focused on improving the insulation, some of them focused on passive solar designs. They all found different things that they could do. And these tools, again, give people the opportunity to learn something about themselves. I want you to think of 3 people that you admire. Now, these people can be real people that you know. They can be people, historical figures, or people on the world stage. But just think of 3 people that you admire for some reason.
Should we write this down?
What you write down is, now, once you've got 3 people in your mind, for each of them, decide what is the characteristic that they've got that causes you to admire them. And try and summarise that characteristic in a single word or a short phrase. And the more precise you can be, the better. So we move on to step 2. So for this one, I now want you to think of 3 people of whom you're very critical. Now, these people must be people in your life. I don't want you choosing Hitler and Stalin, all right? Nor even Tony Blair or Margaret Thatcher. These are people in your life who wind you up in some way. People of whom you are critical. And when you've got the 3, you go through exactly the same process. Try to identify exactly what it is about each one of them that causes you to be so critical of them. And it's these characteristics of them that I want you to summarise. So you did it for 3 people you admire, now you do it for 3 people that you're very critical of. You mean people you work with, your mother, your father, your daughter, the next door neighbour, anyone. Now, this is also called a projection exercise, because everybody projects onto other people aspects of themselves that they haven't accepted about themselves yet. So, those 3 characteristics that you admire in other people, they're yours, but you haven't yet owned them completely. I'm going to talk a little bit about why that's tricky. In fact, it's almost harder for most people to own their positive characteristics than their negative ones. There's several reasons for this. The first is that you just take it for granted. You know, I did this exercise with all the senior policemen in New Scotland Yard. I was training the New Scotland Yard police. Without exception, all of the men and women involved had bravery as one of the things that they admired. And they didn't see themselves as brave. Even though, on a day-by-day basis, they walked into situations which were extremely dangerous. No, I'm not brave, I'm just doing my job. And that's part of the difficulty. What you're really good at, you just take for granted. Okay, so that's one reason why it's difficult to own your positive characteristics. Another one is because it's socially unacceptable. If you start going around saying, well, I'm good at this and I'm good at that, people are going to say, oh, you're so up yourself, or you're a big head, or something like that. It's difficult. Now, I'm going to give you an example, and every time I give this example, I still feel embarrassed, even though I've done it literally hundreds of times. So when I was working at the Open University, it took me ages and ages and ages to realise that I was actually smarter than my fellow academics. I should have tweaked it. I had more research grants, I had written more papers, I had written more teaching material. I was a professor by the time I was 34. The indicators were all there, but I didn't get it. I just thought everybody was like me. I wasn't any more intelligent or less intelligent. As a result, I was misjudging other people's intelligence. I was assuming, if you're as intelligent as me, why aren't you doing it as quickly as I can? And I was getting pissed off with people. Slowly the penny dropped. Oh, hang on a minute. They're not as bright as I am. So take that into account. I still find it embarrassing to tell you this. I mean, it's socially difficult, all right? All right. The other thing I want to give you is, as I told you, I've done this hundreds of times. In the 90s, when I was doing this most, a lot of people chose Nelson Mandela as somebody they admired. He was an admirable figure. But you know, virtually all of them chose something different. Some people chose his compassion, some his forgiveness, some his leadership, some his dancing around, some his happiness, some his determination. So even though he was a figure of admiration, the bit that they resonated with was the bit in them that they hadn't owned. You get it? So take it seriously. When you're admiring somebody, just, okay, that person's good, but what is that telling you about yourself? It might be worth following that through. Okay, so now we come to the other part, the criticalness. So you've got 3 positive attributes, now you've got 3 negative attributes, 3 things that you were critical of in other people. Nobody likes hearing this. You are only critical of other people when there's something the same in you. All right, now this takes a little bit of time to sink in, and I'm going to explain it in some depth. Because this is actually one of the most powerful tools I have for personal awareness. It can also really improve relationships, as I'll tell you in some of my stories. So I'm going to give you some personal examples. And this will help understand or clarify various aspects. So, when I was younger, I smoked cigarettes, and I tried to stop smoking cigarettes several times. Each time I tried to stop smoking, I became very critical of people who were still smoking. Filthy habit, it's not good, you shouldn't do it. But I was critical of them, right? Eventually, I did actually succeed in giving up cigarettes and stop smoking. And then I found I was compassionate towards people who were still smoking. I knew how hard it was to give up. I remembered the struggle I'd been through. So instead of being critical of them, I was compassionate towards them. I still had a judgment that it wasn't the right thing to do. But instead of overlaying that judgment with, oh, you're a bad person, you should, I was overlaying it with compassion. That's not a good thing to do, and I know how hard it is to give up. So the judgment is different from the criticalness. You can make a judgment about whether something's good or bad, right or wrong. The criticalness is an overlay. It's an emotional overlay that comes from something inside yourself. All right, that's a smoking example. Haha. I had a friend. Unfortunately, he died a couple of years ago. A good friend. Whenever he walked into the room, if he walked into the room right now, he'd make a loud noise and attract attention. He always had to be the centre of attention. It didn't matter what was going on. He'd override people, he'd interrupt people, he'd make a fuss. And it used to drive me nuts. Who's the centre of attention right now? I told you I've done this hundreds of times. Who likes being the centre of attention? And once I twigged that, okay, I like being the centre of attention, and so does he. There were some things that he did, like shouting and interrupting that I still thought weren't right. But again, I stopped being so critical of him and I thought, okay, fair enough, mate. You can be the centre of attention for a bit. I'll let you have it. Right. Now, the tidiness. This is a good example of how it affects a relationship. My wife and my kids call me Mr. Neat and Tidy, okay? I know where everything in the house is. My desk is organised. If somebody wants a pair of scissors, they don't have to look around the house. They know exactly which drawer in my desk has got the scissors and the paper clips in it. So I am the tidy one. My wife, on the other hand, as beautiful and wonderful as she is complete chaos incarnate. She will not find anything. And as you can imagine, this difference between us causes some tension, shall we say. Every now and then I would absolutely blow up because she was being so chaotic and untidy. And so I was doing this criticalness exercise. In fact, I was doing it with a group of Open University tutors. And one of them had heard me talk about how untidy my wife was and said, well, what about you and untidiness, Jake? Is this something in me? Do I have a secret desire to be untidy? Is it so suppressed that I don't know, and that's why I'm critical of my wife? And I thought about it, and I thought about it, and then I got it. And it wasn't that I had a secret desire to be untidy. What it was, I interpreted her untidiness as her not caring for me. I thought, she's left all her clothes all over the bedroom, that shows she doesn't care for me. So it was my interpretation of what she was doing that was driving the criticalness in me. And sure, I know many times when I don't care for other people, I understand that. But now I suddenly understood this tidiness issue wasn't about whether the clothes were in the wardrobe or on the floor. This was about whether she cared for me. I felt a bit resolved about it, and I told Eva, my wife, I said, I'm sorry, honey, I've been reacting to your untidiness, assuming that it meant you didn't care for me. And she said, oh, I'm sorry about that. And I'm not exaggerating. Within 6 months, she was being more tidy. I said, what's going on? Bless her, she said, I just wanted to let you know that I really care for you. Really, it was a fantastic outcome from me persisting in finding out what it was in me that was reacting to this criticalness, to this untidiness. All right. Well, wrong one. Okay. So for all of the things that you identified that you were critical of in other people, try to find out what it is in yourself that you can learn from that. Okay? It sometimes it's obvious, sometimes it takes time. But the one thing that you need to know is that there are no exceptions. If you were critical, it's telling you something about you. And your criticalness is different from your judgment. So that I still judge smoking as being unhealthy, I still judge untidiness as being not helpful, and so on. But my criticalness on those issues is gone. Almost. All right. So look, the reason why I included this stuff, both in this talk and in the talks that I gave to the police in New Scotland Yard and in the talks I gave to the Open University tutors, was because in my experience, people are as effective as they are open. And the way that you can be more open is to understand yourself more. Once you understand and accept yourself, it's much easier to understand and accept other people, and then your effectiveness will go up. So this exercise, this projection exercise, is one of the most powerful tools that I've come across. I've used it for at least the last 40 years, and I've recommended it to hundreds of other people. All right. Find the benefits for yourself. Don't take my word for it. Anybody, you want to ask me any questions about this? Or is this okay? We're still doing all right.
What sort of reactions or feedback or experiences have you had from other people who've tried this in the past?
Well, there is often, no, this doesn't apply to me. And I'll tell you an example which might clarify this. So I was teaching this to a bunch of senior civil servants. And one of the people there had put on, he was very critical of a friend of his who kept on saying anti-Semitic jokes. He would say jokes about Jews. And he said, but I'm really not anti-Semitic. I'm really not. This exercise hasn't worked. It's really not about me being anti-Semitic. And I probed him a little bit further. I said, okay, so what is it about this guy's anti-Semitic jokes that is winding you up, really? If it's not the anti-Semitism, what is it? And it turned out that the guy was telling jokes at inappropriate times. And it was the inappropriateness, not the content. So people sometimes have needed that help to go below the surface. And sometimes it's not easy. Sometimes it takes time to sink in. Oh, that's what it's really about. So that's, people initially will often push it back and say, no, it doesn't apply to me. But over time, I've got very, very positive responses to it. All right? Now, this next tool is about making changes. And I wish I had known about this when I was a young man trying to persuade people to build more energy efficient houses and all that sort of stuff. Because basically this is about the reason why people trying to initiate change often doesn't work. And not only does it not work when you're trying to make the world different, it also doesn't work when people are organising training courses. Hear this. No, seriously, a lot of people go on training courses, they take in all the material, and they think, oh yes, yes, and then they go back to their day job and they behave exactly the same. Nothing has changed. And that's a real problem because they spent 4 or 5 days and a lot of money and they didn't get anything out of it. The reason why is that most people who are trying to induce change, even in other people or in the world, don't understand the obstacles, the things that are preventing change from happening. As well as being keen on systems, on energy, I'm also a teacher of systems. In fact, I was a professor of energy systems. And in the world of systems theory, you know that any system that survives for any length of time has got ways of surviving. And those ways of surviving, it will adapt and make sure it doesn't change. That's what systems are all about. All right. So we're talking about change. This is called an immunity to change exercise based on a book. The process that I'm going to describe will work for an individual, but it can also be used for a team. If a team of people are trying to induce a change in a community or in a business, this same process can be used collectively. It also illustrates very powerfully for me how personal awareness can really help. All right, so in order to make this process work here and now, I want you to think of something that you're committed to doing in your life. It could be in your relationship, in your work, in your job, with your kids, I don't mind where, that would lead to some improvement in your view. It shouldn't be something that you think you should do. It's something that your commitment to do it is for personal reasons, for yourself. All right? And it should also obviously be something that you haven't yet realised. It's a commitment you've got that hasn't yet been fulfilled. So I want you to complete the statement starting with, I am committed to. And I thought I'd show you some examples. So these are the examples that I've come up with that are very general. And the one at the bottom was the one that I did for myself when I was teaching a lot of people about systems thinking. I was committed to learning to be more effective in teaching others how to be more effective. So that's I'll carry that story through as we go through the steps. So what's your commitment? What are you committed to doing for yourself that you haven't yet achieved? All right, now, the next step, I want you to figure out what you're doing or not doing that's preventing you from realising this commitment. Now look, I'm not doubting your sincerity or your commitment. It's just that, given life, you can't do all the things that you set out to do. So there are almost certainly some things that you should stop doing if you want to fulfil your commitment, and some things that you should do if you want to fulfil it. So I just want you to identify your role in not fulfilling your commitment. It's just little things. So I'll give you some examples. What I'm not doing, these are the examples that other people came up with. But remember, my example was I'm committed to teaching people how to be more effective. And I need to find out how effective I am. But I didn't try new things. And I wasn't clear about what I meant by effectiveness. And I wasn't seeking feedback. So those were the three things that I was not doing that I should have done if I really wanted to fulfill my commitment. Do you get the idea? So aim for three things of things that you could either stop doing or do that would help fulfill the commitment that you started off with. This next step is the tricky one. Okay, so far it's been fairly straightforward. What I want you to do now, those three things that you're not doing in step 2, I want you to imagine doing them. And what I want you to do, as you imagine doing it, notice what bothers you. Typically, what people notice is something that they're afraid of, something that some fear comes up. Sometimes it's not fear, sometimes it's embarrassment. So basically what I want you to do is to just try to... So I'll give you my examples, okay? So the things I wasn't doing. I wasn't trying out new things. When I imagined trying new things, I thought, oh my God, that could fall flat on its face. I could look an idiot. I wasn't getting feedback. Well, actually, it's the same sort of thing. If I get feedback, maybe they tell me I'm wasting their time. I didn't really define what I meant by effectiveness. If I did, maybe I would see that. So you see, all those three things, if I start to imagine doing them, I notice there's a fear in me. And that's what I just want you to try to notice what that fear is about. There may be separate little things associated with each of the statements in step 2, or it may be the same thing. For me, there was one overriding thing that was the same when I imagined doing them. Right. Now, whatever you discovered in step 3 is a clue to your competing commitment. It's another commitment that you've got. For example, I was basically afraid of looking foolish. So as well as having my commitment to helping people teach other people how to be more effective, I had another commitment going, which was I'm committed to not looking stupid. Get the idea? Yeah, you may have several of these commitments running, or there may be one that overrides or captures all of them. The one that I got that captured all of the things that I was afraid of was I was committed to having people hold me in high regard. In other words, regard me well. I didn't want to look foolish, I didn't want to look stupid, I didn't want them to be laughing at me, I didn't want to fail, you get the idea. So I wanted people to hold me in high regard. Try and get a sense of what your competing commitment is. This is the commitment based on the fears, the things that you don't want to happen. Right. If your competing commitment had a negative in it, like I'm committed to not being in control, to not being out of control, then you remove it and you start the sentence saying, I assume that if I were out of control, what would happen? If your competing commitment didn't have a negative in it, put one in. So my competing commitment said, I'm committed to having people hold me in high regard. If people didn't hold me in high regard, then what do I imagine will happen? All right. Now let me try and make sense of all this for you. This big assumption that you've just written down, this is the key. And you have to work backwards. So this big assumption, I'll take mine. If people did not hold me in high regard, they would not want to know me or be with me. So that's my underlying fear. That's my script in life, all right? And if I now go backwards, I find that my competing commitment, which was I'm committed to people holding me in high regard, is protecting me from that fear. And the things that I wasn't doing for my original commitment, I wasn't trying new things, I wasn't asking for feedback, I wasn't defining effective, they were all serving my competing commitment, which were protecting me from my fear. Which was the reason why I wasn't doing the thing that I was committed to doing. So it makes sense when you go backwards. And that's why these people called it immunity to change. That underlying assumption was what was stopping me from changing to being more effective. And I didn't know it until I did this exercise and really uncovered it. And the authors called it an immunity to change because it is like an immune system. It's looking after you. It's looking after that big assumption. Okay, so that's the way to make sense of it. What to do about it? I have to tell you that if you do this process on stuff that you're really committed to, you will discover stuff about yourself that is very hard to change. This thing about, I assume that if people don't hold me in high regard, they won't want to be with me. It goes back to my childhood. My parents were very unkind to me, but the only people who liked me were my teachers. They thought I was great. And they had told me I had to be held in high regard. That's where I got my goodies from. I wasn't getting it at home. So that was the source of this big assumption. To change that is really a lot of work. It's not going to happen overnight. Just realising it doesn't make a big difference. It can take months. So the first thing, if you want to use what you've just discovered, you have to start by understanding, where did this assumption come from? How is it operating in my life? Where does it crop up? And then you start to find ways to test. Well, supposing I didn't try to outperform everybody so that everybody held me in high regard. Supposing I didn't do that just once. Would people still like me? And I do it in a safe place. You know, I don't do it when I'm standing up in front of 50 coppers in New Scotland Yard. All right. So, if you're interested in changing yourself or in implementing change in the world, you need to understand this type of process. Because this is where the obstacles are to you making change and to other people making changes. Yeah?
Have you tested your big assumption? You're saying that you're worried about taking risks. Because
yes.
If you do, then you...
Yes. It's been much... I've found it easier to test that as... I'm now fully retired, but as I retired, I allowed myself to test it bit by bit.
Yes.
So and now I'm a chicken farmer. I mean, seriously, that's what I spend a lot of my time doing, which isn't the same as writing research papers and standing up in front of people. So, and people still like me. Okay, so it did take time, and I'm probably not at the end of that road, but I've made progress on it. Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about how this works in group situations? And I'm thinking specifically for this interdependence course, if there are little groups of people wanting to create change in their communities, what pieces of advice maybe you could give them for using this?
Okay. Now, I've never run a session using this in a group. I've only read the book about it. And apparently, from reading the book, the most important thing is right at the beginning, deciding what the group is actually committed to. All right? And they will have a declared thing that they're committed to. And that's the starting point. And then when they start to list all the things that they're not doing, they start to realise, oh, actually, we're each looking out for our own self-interest here somehow, or there are other things that are going on. So a lot of the benefit from doing this in groups occurs quite early on in the process of clarifying what you're committed to. And then when a commitment is finally sorted out, the immunity to change resolves itself quite quickly and people can see what they're facing. Yeah. Great, you've been asking me any other questions and comments?
How's chicken farming?
It's great, I have to tell you. Yeah. All right. Then I want to leave you with this thought, because it is so easy to do this sort of exercise and think, oh, that was interesting and stuff, and never do it again. And actually, these tools can be really useful in your life, but to be really useful, you've got to use them more than once. That's it. Thank you very much for your attention.